The program says that we have a brief facilitated discussion before throwing it open to questions. So, Simon, let me be positive about what you've said. I think what you've said is an important counter to the almost childlike belief in the magic of the market that infects politics, particularly in Canberra, and the widespread delusion that if only we can get a carbon price, then everything will magically correct itself. I mean, compared with that, belief in the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus looks comparatively sophisticated, because the idea that simply setting a modest carbon price will bring the big polluters to heel overnight is just ridiculous, I think. And if we look analytically at it, the only areas where there has been significant environmental progress has been as a result of legislation rather than trusting the market. The only environmental indicator that's actually improved in Australia in the last 20 years is urban air quality. Why has it improved? Because we legislated for unleaded petrol, which the industry fought tooth and nail despite the accumulating evidence that lead retards the intellectual development of small children. And we were then able to legislate for catalytic converters, so the emissions per vehicle are dramatically less than it used to be. I mean, we're working on the problem by having more vehicles and driving them further, but in the short term, urban air quality is actually better. The one successful example of solving a global environmental problem is the depletion of the ozone layer. And it was because we had first the Montreal Protocol, then the Stockholm, and finally the London Conference tightening it up. So we actually banned the release of chlorofluorocarbons. And by the London Convention, even as an outrageous advocate of the free market as Margaret Thatcher actually said at that conference, we are not owners of the planet, but tenants with a fully repairing lease. In other words, the science has spoken, we've got to do something about it. That's the positive. The negative is 20 years ago, COAG adopted the National Strategy for Ecologically Sustainable Development. So in principle, the precautionary principle, conservation of biological diversity, maintenance of ecological integrity, intergenerational equity should inform all decisions at every level. Yet we are still seeing approval of coal-fired power stations, we're still seeing approval of developments that clearly breach those principles. And the most fundamental worry is the loss of biological diversity, because, as one of my colleagues pointed out to me when I was banging on about climate change, the damage we're doing to the climate could in principle be repaired within 100 years. The damage we're doing to biological diversity may be irreversible, but if we could reverse it, it would take millions of years rather than decades. And we're currently losing species, as you probably know, at a rate comparable with that of the 5 previous great extinction events in the history of the planet. So, we're really doing pretty well if you think that our mission is to erode biological diversity. So, Simon, what grounds are there for optimism that we can solve problems like climate change and loss of biodiversity through the law?
I think every day there are examples of decisions which are sensitive. Clearly, there are headline decisions that, for political and social reasons, are compromises which are too much of a compromise. But I suppose the positive aspect that I take is that we keep seeing examples of things that would be far worse if, in fact, environmental policy didn't apply. And I know it is variable across the country, and if I do say so, as a Queenslander, I have had sympathy for your suite of laws in the environmental and planning field for decades, and you basically followed Victoria by 20 years. And
I don't think we're that close.
but certainly I can track right through the whole, or every stream of environmental planning law, and indicate where things would have been far, far worse. The difficulty, of course, is that the challenges of environmental deterioration are so extreme, and the huge driver of carbon emissions is almost defeating all the other wins. And part of the problem, I'm convinced, is the language we use. And the Montreal Protocol and the closing of the ozone hole is a perfect example of how if you get the message across, it helps. Now, Ian and I come from a generation where we would have run out into the playground as kids and probably put oil on our bodies and run onto the beach and never have thought of suntan protection or a hat. But then we saw skin cancers all around the world. And then universally what happened, partly driven by liability law, we saw hats appearing. And it basically we found that every grandparent and every parent had reinforced on a daily basis their kids going out to school, because it basically became a universal requirement. It wasn't just Australia, of people putting hats on, broadband, sometimes cap, sometimes sort of flap hats, but whatever the hat was, there was a message. And the message was, it will affect you, what you have always done. And with climate change, in my view, it's getting the message across in societal change terms, not in science terms, because I think science is a real turn-off for the broad community. But the more you actually think of how it will impact, the more I think we can bring about the change. And then if we can bring about a different perspective, we'll then be more amenable, we as a community, to better environmental laws. And the trouble is, all the pollsters are asking the wrong questions, looking to the politician.
We can't afford pollsters.
But what happens is, are you prepared to pay $5 extra in your gas or power bill to address climate change? And because there's a confusion of what climate change is or whether it's actually happening, then the majority at the moment are now saying, no, we're not going to. That's industry's problem, or that's someone else's problem, or it doesn't need to be addressed at all. But if you just convert the question to saying, are you worried about poisoning pollution that threatens the very life that you are living now? Those images of polluted cities like Bangkok or Beijing, if that was you, would you like to bring up a child in a city like that? And of course, everyone said, no, good God, no. And then you ask, well, if you were told that that image you see of the polluted city and the poisoning environment is actually a carbon emission and related gases, and that is what climate change is all about, do you think we ought to do something about it? And the answer will be yes. So it's a matter of perspective, and it's a matter of honesty, and the absolutely despicable way the debate has been distorted in federal parliament at the moment with the lack of leadership is reinforcing this appalling message. So we're not going to get the necessary legal reforms that are required in the immediate future while we get the message wrong. Quite frankly, we have seen a number of extremes of climate change impact over the last few years, simultaneously, globally, which should reinforce the message constantly. And we should say, well, do you want to have a Queensland flood like that next year and the year after? Do you want this to be repeated and the billions of dollars to be lost? Well, if you do, all right, we'll go on the way we're going. But face realities. What we're watching is a climate change phenomenon. Sorry.
Thanks, Simon. Larissa, my question for you is, it's great to have more Greens in Parliament, and it's great to have them in principle holding the balance of power in the Senate. My worry is that on any really progressive legislation to protect the environment, you will face a united front from the ALP and the Coalition. And I argued in a book chapter I wrote 20 years ago that just as the politics of the 20th century was dominated by the struggle between the Labor Party and changing coalitions of conservative forces who wanted to oppose their agenda, I don't think it's at all fanciful to suggest the politics of the 21st century will be the struggle between the Greens and changing coalitions of forces who still believe in unlimited growth in a closed system and will keep rearranging to oppose whatever you're putting forward. So the real question is, how confident can we be that the balance of power will enable you actually to enact progressive legislation?
Well, thank you, Ian. You've hit the nail on the head there. Balance of power has a lovely ring to it, but it really only works when the two big parties disagree. And often they completely agree. When it comes to resource use, when it comes to consumption, when it comes to vested interests, they're pretty much the same. I mean, we've seen with the ascension of Abbott, he is starting to oppose things blindly and seemingly without reason, but whatever. So that will perhaps give some more scope for the Greens to negotiate with Labor on whatever outcome it is that Parliament is dealing with at the time. But the fundamental point remains, unless the major parties aren't in bed with each other, then the Greens can't do anything. So we need the community to be demanding better of the major parties. We all vote, and that's great, but that's only once every 3 years. So we need you in between to hold your politicians to account and to tell them what it is that you want. Vested interests, lobby groups, fossil fuels sector, property developers, they've all got their lobby groups that get access to these ministers, can get appointments. The major parties are hearing all of this information. And where's the community? It's impossible for a community member to get an appointment with a minister. You have to wait months and months and months, and you may not even get one at all. So that's why you need to use all of these fabulous new tools that we've now got available to make sure that your representative, who is there meant to be representing you, knows what it is that you think and you want them to do. So, this is a call for active democracy. If you want to improve outcomes from our system, sure, vote Green, but in between, if you don't get a Green elected in your seat, or vote as you will. I see this man chuckling. I'll vote Green. You vote as you will, but have a good long think about it and vote in accordance with your values, whoever that might be, and then hold them to account and tell them what you want, because that's how real change happens. It's when people demand it.
I think that's absolutely right. I remind people that organisations like ACF trot along to Canberra, but for every one environmental lobbyist that goes to Canberra, there's thousands, literally thousands of lobbyists from the big end of town who are there blowing in their ear, urging them to do nothing. And change will only happen if enough people are telling their backbench members of Parliament that their seat is at risk if something isn't done.